The Dampiers on Lake Superior. The Dampier family, for the most part, have been a commercial fishing and pulpwood salvage family for more or less a century. I have made several trips back to my hometown of Nipigon to spend time with family and old friends and to revisit some of the places on Lake Superior that keep calling me back. I recently found out that there was a Dampier Cove and Dampier Islands that neither myself nor any of the family that I talked to ever knew about. Our stomping grounds was mostly Nipigon and Black Bays. Dampier Cove and Islands are roughly 100 miles to the east. So for this trip in 2022, I wanted to explore those two places, learn the history, and make a video for the rest of the family to see. This thought grew, and I decided to include any of the Dampier fishing camps and family historical places. If this isn't done, my fear is that some of this knowledge is not likely to reach the next generation. We will also be carrying out a hunt for a family treasure that has been lost to us for more than 70 years. My great-grandfather, Francis James Dampier, was born in 1856 and was the first recorded Dampier in Canada when Francis moved from Vermont to live with his grandmother in Bolton, Quebec in 1871. Francis later married Lucina Wing and had 4 children before moving to the Rossport-Nipigon area, where they had 6 more children. His occupation was listed as a tradesman and later on a fisherman. This video is focused on the mariners bearing the Dampier name, their boats, roles, and associated places of work and residence. Here is a list of the Dampier men through the generations. I'm the guy at the bottom of the sheet. I also spent most of my life as a fisherman, first with my father Gordon on Lake Superior, and then moving to Canada's west coast. This begins the story of the Dampiers on Lake Superior. I have also included a few historical facts and some personal family experiences to spice up the video. I launched my boat Seagull 2 on July 15, 2022 at Marathon and ran southeast for about 20 miles to Oiseau Bay and Dampier Cove. Use caution nearing the entrance to Dampier Cove. There are a few outer shoals and a rock in the entrance channel, but as long as you are careful, a good-sized boat with a 6-foot draft should be fine. I must admit that I was pleasantly surprised at how nice of a cove this is. There's good shelter, good holding bottom, enough room for several boats, and it has its own caretaker. Mr. Beaver has his house here and does an occasional patrol. The place also comes with its own birdsong serenade. Oiseau in Oiseau Bay is French for bird. A coincidence? Perhaps not. The next morning, I couldn't resist dipping my pot into the water and making a cup of Dampier Cove coffee. If you come here, make sure that you have a small boat that you can explore with. There are a few nice sand beaches, including all along the bottom of Oiseau Bay itself. Don't forget your fishing rods. You only have to get down about 25 feet beside the rock piles to score a cold water lake trout for dinner. Dampier Cove was named in 1965 in recognition of Will Dampier, who lived and fished in the area. Will was the oldest son of Francis. Next was a 15-mile run back to Heron Bay. Dampier Islands are somewhat exposed rock islands that are unremarkable to me, except for the name. They were named that sometime prior to 1957, in lieu of Dampier's Landing, which no longer existed. Now back to the Marathon area. Great-uncle Will Dampier reportedly also fished out of Port Caldwell in 1912, as indicated in the book A Trip on the Great Lakes by Raymond S. Spears, about his paddling sailing trip in 1912. A very interesting read. Included in this book is the only known picture of Will's steam fishing tug, Pigeon. Also mentioned in his book was an amiable encounter with Will's dad Francis and his youngest brother Charlie, who were fishing in the St. Ignace Island area. The friendly staff at the Marathon Museum were very obliging, but they had no records on hand that refer to the Dampier family, despite there being relatively local places bearing our name. Further west of there lies the Slate Islands. My Uncle Jack's old boat Jim Dandy was used by the ministry to transport caribou from here back in the late 1980s. They moved some of them from the Slate Islands to St. Ignace Island on board the fishing tug in an effort to transplant and to help save the species. If you are ever cruising through the islands in this area, you might still see the remnants of the pen holding area along the shore. These majestic creatures had a tough time surviving. When the winters are really cold, the lake would freeze, giving wolves easy access to the islands. Rossport is the next stop. It has a long history as a maritime port, going back to sailboats and steamships. It was known as McKay's Harbor in the late 1800s, and the Dampiers arrived not long after. Rossport Harbor looks like this today, but was a bit different about 100 years ago. The furthest boat away in this photograph is a steam paddle wheeler. This is a neat little town with lots of history. My grandfather Arthur was the first born in the area at Gravel River in 1890. Their home was reportedly a short distance south of the railway bridge. Several of the Dampier family were born in Rossport, including my father Gordon in 1923. I have been told that the original Dampier house was across the main road and in line with the road leading to the government dock. Francis Dampier and his sons Will, Frank, Arthur, Tom, and Charlie had boats and fished in the surrounding area, and harvested pulpwood in later years. At least one of the sons, Charlie, later on also harvested pulpwood on Lake Nipigon, as well as having a coffee shop in McDermott with memorable vanilla milkshakes. Even with the poor quality of this picture, the size of the lake trout that great-grandpa Francis is holding up is an unmistakable testament to how big these fish can get. The largest one ever recorded was almost 102 pounds. Now we move into the Nipigon Bay area. In the Nipigon Straits there is a place called Sand Point where Francis and his family lived, probably after moving from Gravel River and before moving to Rossport. They had twin sons here, James and Tom, born in July 1894. James later drowned in the Nipigon River in 1932. There was at least one other family living at Sand Point at the time. They were the Gagnons. There is a gravesite here of a baby or young child of the Gagnons. I went ashore here to see if anything remained, but could not find any signs of buildings nor the gravesite. With my metal detector, I found garbage areas that produced several old cans and cooking pots, evidence that this was a substantial residence for some period of time. Moving to Grandpa Arthur's camp on LaGrange Island, him and his two brothers Tom and Charlie fished together and had a camp on Verd Island at Craigie's Harbor. The brothers went their own way and left the cabin to Arthur. He towed it to his new spot on LaGrange Island and skidded it up on the beach there, where it was enjoyed for many years. This building makes another more incredible journey, which I will get to later on. Arthur married my grandma Lottie in 1912. They had 11 children that lived and one that didn't survive. She had 6 boys and 5 girls over a period of 26 years. Virtually unheard of today, but not uncommon back then. Arthur was a pretty handy guy. He built his own boat, Seagull, beside their house at the mudflats. If you look close, you can see him working inside the boat's framing. He also made a skid cradle out of logs, so the boat could be taken out of the water during the winters. Don Clark of Nipigon Lakes Timber commissioned him to build the tug DCEC. Arthur also built a wild rice harvester, which he used in Cashabawi, a small town west of Thunder Bay. He must have done this with his older brother Frank, as they both had their firstborn children here, Art and Lottie's daughter Mary, and Frank's son John, who was the Nipigon postmaster for decades. Arthur and Lottie's oldest son Harold owned a fishing license that included a camp at Caribou Cove. He owned the boats Norma and Bluefin, and fished mainly with his son Sonny, and later with his nephew Randy, Henry's oldest son, who eventually bought the boat from his uncle Harold. Caribou Cove has become very popular with local and traveling mariners. Be advised that it is a shallow water dock, but there is good anchorage not far from there. The site has been kept up and maintained by generous local volunteers. The sauna works great and is open to everyone. Bringing your own firewood would be appreciated. Please respect this as a heritage site. Sign the guest book, check out the somewhat family-friendly graffiti and artwork, use the good luck Biffy, or pull up a chair and roast some marshmallows. Please don't take any souvenirs. The second oldest son was George. He had one boat called a Dispatch. I don't recall him fishing or doing pulpwood salvage under his own license, but he and his oldest sons Johnny and David worked often with the rest of the Dampiers. Grandpa Arthur took delivery of his newly built steel tug Rosalie D in 1946 and passed the Seagull to his third son and my father, Gordon, who recently returned from overseas after serving in World War II. Grandpa named the new boat after his youngest daughter, Rosalie. We fished and picked pulpwood with the Seagull, mostly as a family operation. I distinctly remember us losing a blade off of the propeller one time. We had a very slow, shaky run back to Nipigon. There was a full drum of gas on the back deck that left a permanent deep ring in the decking. In 1959, Dad bought the 45-foot steel-hulled Seagull 3. He needed a larger boat so we could enter the herring and other fisheries. He had a camp across from Sand Point in Nipigon Straits that he had bought from one of the forest or mining companies. He floated and towed the building 50 miles to Squaw Bay in Black Bay, in the shadow of the Sleeping Giant, where we used it for many years as our herring fishing camp. It was simply a coincidence that his boats were named Seagull and Seagull 3. In commemoration to my dad, that is why I named my little boat Seagull 2. When Dad first started herring fishing, the fish was sold as mink feed for $39.50 a ton. He started out using baskets, but the industry soon switched over to 50-pound stackable wooden boxes. Herring eventually became a human food source, and the prices went up accordingly. As in this and virtually every other case, the government did a lousy job of managing the fishery. There were years when some fishermen were taking over 150 tons and fishing well into December if the ice held off. In an effort to self-regulate the fishery, a maximum 100-ton quota system was adopted by the fishermen, at least for the larger boats. Besides us, Jack and Henry Dampier with the Jim Dandy and the Pelican also fished herring out of Squaw Bay. We started out fishing them with gill nets, but switched to an otter trawl, which was way easier, but we mistakenly went back to even larger mesh gill nets. This was somewhat dictated by the companies, who wanted a higher percentage of the larger females for their roe. This greed and lack of government control caused a steep decline in the resource, and yes, us fishermen share the blame. This fishery took place starting around the beginning of November and normally went to freeze up. There was often much ice to contend with, as seen in these pictures. It was quite a challenge just getting the boat turned around to get pointed out some mornings. The Seagull 3 had a thicker hull than some of the other boats, so Dad was often breaking ice for them. He eventually modified the bow to climb up on the ice, which made it much more effective. Once we were out in open water, you had to be careful of the freezing spray, as it can easily make a boat top heavy. When this happened, I would often heat up damp claws on the engine exhaust and hold them onto the front window, just to melt a small clear area for Dad to see through. I remember fishing herring in Black Bay when the Edmund Fitzgerald went down in eastern Lake Superior in November of 1975. For me, living 2,000 miles away, herring fishing was more than just work. It also gave me a chance to spend time with family and friends, and to work alongside my dad, older brother Alvin, cousins, and nephews. Memories like that will be forever cherished. Dad also had the 38-foot wooden tug Miss Pigeon, which we did use for a summer, but he bought it for the GM diesel. After rebuilding it over the winter with his older brother Harold in his garage, he put it into the Seagull 3, replacing the 6-cylinder Grey Marine engine. The Miss Pigeon also had a very powerful winch. Dad used it to pull his brother's boats out of the water for winter storage that fall. Unfortunately, he pulled the bow stem right out of one of my uncle's wooden boats. We left the Miss Pigeon frozen in the ice near the government dock that winter, and the ice pressure caused the boat to leak quite a bit. I used to pump it out twice a day, including during my school lunch break. I was about 12 then, and I swear it was uphill both ways. Uncles Jack and Henry were partners for much of their time on the water. They both had camps at 5 Mile Point. Jack and Henry also jointly owned the B&B. Then Jack owned a wooden boat called the Ugly Duckling, but later bought the steel-hull Jim Dandy. It was used for gillnet fishing, pulpwood salvage, and as a herring trawler. Henry had the wooden tug Swanberg, and later on the steel-hulled Pelican, which was also rigged for trawling. It eventually got trucked to Lake Nipigon, and it is now based in Gull Bay. Jack and Henry also collected pulpwood from the shores of Jesse Lake, partway up the Nipigon River to Lake Nipigon. I want to make a brief detour now to talk about the search for the lost Dampier treasure. When Uncles Jack and Henry owned the B&B, they were out near Moss Harbor along with their dad Arthur on the Rosalie D. Somehow the B&B caught fire and almost burned to the waterline. Arthur pushed the burnt hulk onto the beach with the Rosalie D. There wasn't much left of the boat, but it had some usable parts that they wanted to salvage, so they decided to tow it to the camp at LaGrange Island. Jack found the brass ship's bell, probably in the ashes, and stowed it under a stump on the beach at Moss Harbor so it could be retrieved at a later date. Jack never went back for the ship's bell, but told his sons Dan, Jim, and Gerard about it and where the boat was beached. What was left of the B&B still lies at the bottom near the LaGrange camp. So part of this 2022 mission was to try to locate the lost ship's bell from the B&B. I connected with Jack's oldest son Boone, Danny, and his wife Eileen, and we went treasure hunting. Boone and Eileen still own Jack's old boat, the Jim Dandy. We left Dampier's Landing in Nipigon, towing my boat as well as a smaller skiff, and headed for Moss Island. We did a good sweep of the area where we knew the boat had been beached, and even with 2 metal detectors, we came up empty. Our hopes were raised briefly when Boone found a good signal. I was just reaching for my camera when he held up a corroded pop can. Talk about a letdown. I went back there twice by myself later on, hoping to find the ship's bell, but with no luck, except for more pop cans. I saved one of them that still had part of its design, just to see if I could identify it, and possibly a year. It turned out to be an England-only issue of a 7-Up can from 1992, and had a cartoon image of a guy playing pool. Now, how the heck did that make its trip to Moss Harbor? Our next joint effort was to try to locate an outpost cabin that our grandfather Arthur used. We knew that it was on an unnamed island on the inside of Spar Island, not far from Moss Harbor. We found this beautiful little spot easily. It turned out to be the remains of an 8x12 log cabin, big enough to sleep and cook in, but not much more. As you can see, there isn't much left of the cabin. There were several rusty cans around, so it was certainly used to some degree. It is unclear if Grandpa was using it for fishing, trapping, prospecting, or perhaps Grandma sent him here as a form of birth control. If that was the case, I don't know if it worked or not. Sticking to the outside, we move over to the St. Ignace area. Arthur married Lottie in 1912, and they had their honeymoon at a fish camp on Bowman Island, also known as Little St. Ignace Island. I am making my own assumption that the fish camp belonged to a Rossport fish buyer named Bowman, and the name of the island took on his name. Here is an old photo of what the camp looked like in its heyday. Today it looks like this. Apparently the honeymoon camp was to the west of the main camp and burned down many years ago. I visited here in 2011 along with my sister Darlene and her husband Bill Mayer, and there is some degradation and overgrowth since then. One of the more significant changes to me is that someone took a Camp Fisheries sign as a souvenir. If you enjoy looking at the artifacts, the next visitor would enjoy seeing them as well. There are a couple of small fishboat hulks still somewhat intact. This one bears the name Shell. I suspect that this may have belonged to the Shelling family, who were also active in the fishing industry. If one takes a short walk up a cleared trail, you'll come across a gravesite with a cement cross. As depicted on the attached plate, a lighthouse keeper from Talbot Island was buried here. The spelling Lampshire, according to historical records, is wrong, and the correct spelling is Lampier. Talbot Island is believed by the Ojibwe Indians to be a haunted place. The first lighthouse keeper in 1867 was William Perry, who after spending an uneventful season left the island in November and headed for the Hudson's Bay trading post in Nipigon. He only had a small boat to make the 25-mile voyage in. The unforgiving November weather took another's soul, and his body was discovered in Nipigon Bay after the spring thaw. The second was the experienced mariner Thomas Dampier. Him and his native wife decided to spend a winter on Talbot Island and avoid the potentially dangerous November weather. After freeze-up, Thomas got sick and died. With no help available and only rocky frozen ground, his wife wrapped his body in a sail and stowed him in a crevice in the rocks. It wasn't until spring that she signaled a passing Ojibwe canoe party. They found the once beautiful young woman thin and white-haired. The Ojibways took the body to Bowman Island, where he was buried. The third lighthouse keeper was Andrew Hines. After the close of the 1872 shipping season, he left in his small boat heading for Silver Islet, about 50 miles to the west, and in lots of open water. A November storm came up, and he struggled for 18 days before finally reaching Silver Islet. Unfortunately, he died a few days later. After losing 3 consecutive lighthouse keepers, the government decided to shut it down after that. It is claimed by some that the ghostly figure of a white-haired woman can still be seen wandering the island. I can't talk about the area without mentioning what is arguably the most popular spot on northern Lake Superior. That is the CPR Slips, also known as Squaw Harbor to some. The curious name of CPR Slips comes from the fact that the CP Rail Company created the harbor by dredging out the gravels, which were used for rail track bedding. That might have been an excuse to create a pleasant hideaway for the owners and their guests. One can only speculate. Either way, it is a beautiful spot that is privately owned, but respectful mariners are always welcome to tie up to one of the several docks, have a beach fire, or even a sauna. The only other mention that I will make about the outside waters is that in 1965 we were given permission by the U.S. government to harvest the pulpwood that was on the north shores of Isle Royale. So, a flotilla of Dampiers, including Jack with the Jim Dandy, Henry with the Swanberg, and my dad with the Seagull 3, made our way to the U.S. Customs on Isle Royale. Our family spent much of the summer there, collecting and rafting up all the pulpwood. Even though it was hard work, it was still a magical time for a 15-year-old boy. I made enough money that summer to buy a brand new 14-foot crestliner for $265. It felt like I was on top of the world. After catching a couple more lake trout to share with family, we now moved back into Nipigon Bay and to Honeymoon Cove. At the bottom of the cove lies what's left of my dad's boat, the Miss Pigeon. Grandpa Arthur and his sons had an ice house here on the left side of the cove. These were necessary in order to preserve our fish. We also had an ice house at the Nipigon docks. Once the winter ice became thick enough, the family would get together and cut 16-inch blocks out of the lake ice using chainsaws. We used ice tongs to load them on sleds or trucks and fill the ice sheds. That's me and my good friend Danny Johnson on the tongs, loading my dad's 63 Chev pickup. Boone is on the camera, and that was his black 65 Pontiac. Once the ice houses were full, the ice was then covered with a layer of sawdust, which is an excellent insulator. It could last all summer if need be. Near the mouth of the Nipigon River are the vertical rock faces where the Indian paintings can be found. Though fading, they are still visible. These paintings are estimated to be more than 2,000 years old. Arthur and Lottie's youngest son, Kenny, used to take tourists out here in the early 60s to see these on his boat Harvey C. As we move up the Nipigon River and approach the Nipigon docks, this narrow, weedy channel on the left used to be the bay where the groups of houses were and was referred to as the Mudflats. This was a shallow but navigable harbor. The Mudflats was a surprisingly larger community than I ever thought. It consisted of several families with the names Dampier, Gagnon, Blanchette, MacDonald, Hagen, Delaronde, Plouffe, Chaboyer, as well as Jack Nebula, who had a small farm there and would supply some of the locals with milk. There are very few pictures of the Mudflats. I only have a couple that were passed on to me. This is one with my Aunt Lenny, my mother-to-be, Arvella Hudson, in the middle, and a young Uncle Kenny, who was born in 1933. and another of Aunt Rosalie, who thinks this picture was taken shortly after she was almost run over by the same car. Sometime around 1940, some flooding occurred, and a lot of the houses were relocated, and eventually everyone moved into the Nipigon town site. Arthur apparently built their home on Railway Street without telling Grandma. He took her for a drive one day in 44 or 45 and asked her if she liked the look of that new house. She said yes, and he replied, "Good, because it's yours." They lived there blissfully until 1958. They then bought an empty lot on Park Street beside their daughter Rosalie and her husband Ed Belanger. The intention was to build their retirement home there. There was good ice in Nipigon Bay that winter, so Grandpa rallied up a dozen able-bodied men and a few vehicles of some sort and went to the LaGrange campsite. Here they skidded the camp onto the ice and towed it over 10 miles all the way to Park Street. It was to be their temporary shelter while the new house was being built. There is another twist to this story. Their second oldest son, George, had a little boy, Lloyd, nicknamed Porky. George had carved a toy boat which Porky was playing with when he sadly drowned in the back channel near the mudflats around 1946. After that, Grandma hid the toy boat in the attic of the camp, so George would not be reminded of his loss. It lay hidden there until the camp house arrived at Park Street. Rosalie secretly held on to the toy, and when George passed away in later years, she gave the toy to George's grandson, Paddy. Sometime, probably in 1959, while working on the new house, Grandpa Arthur became ill. This turned out to be the beginning of the end. They ended up selling the Park Street property. Grandma Lottie passed away on June 28, 1960, and Arthur went 3 days later on July 1st. You can't tell me that they weren't connected. The Nipigon Harbor area has had much transformation since the late 1800s, when sailboats and steamships would visit the area. The Hudson's Bay Company had a fur trading post at Nipigon. The Nipigon River used to wind through what we call the lagoon. If you look closely, you can see the water currents running parallel alongside the docks. The CN Rail didn't build the causeway until 1908, which changed the river flow to how it looks today. For those who don't understand our methods of fishing and pulpwood salvage, here is a brief overview. We mainly fished for pickerel or walleye, saugers, mainly in Black Bay, that were similar to pickerel, whitefish, trout, and herring. Gill nets were simply made to sit on the bottom and with an anchor and buoy at both ends. The otter trawl is essentially a long tapered sock made of netting and was towed along the bottom by cables and spread apart by doors. A lot of the earlier Dampier fishing was with a pound, or as we called them, pond nets. This is a live trap system where a pile driver was used to create a long fence or lead, and the pond frame and netting was attached. The lead started at the shore and went out to where the pond was. The fish would travel along the shore, come to the fence, follow it out and into the hearts, which fed them into the center of a wide pond made of netting. The fish would then swim around in circles inside the pond and virtually never find their way out. The fishermen would come along at intervals, drop one edge of the pond net briefly, allowing for the pond net punt to enter into the pond. The fishermen would then just have to gather up the pond netting at one side and work the punt towards the caught fish, which made the pond progressively smaller. Once the fish were condensed beside the punt, a hoop net was used to braille the live fish into the punt. Easy peasy. We also fished through the winter some years. This involved driving a vehicle of sorts out onto the ice, cutting holes, and feeding a line under the ice with a jig or a jigger, which when the control line was pulled, the jig would propel itself forward under the ice. This jig would pull our working line to a second hole, then a gill net would be attached and pulled and set under the ice. Dad started doing this with his Model T. I wasn't born yet, but I do remember going out with him in his '56 Chev pickup, and later on a bombardier that looked like this. Wolves were often traveling on the ice, and Dad had a weakness for this. Plus there was a bounty on them, so he never went out without his .303 rifle. He was chasing one once with his bombardier and was up to about 40 miles an hour when it threw a track. He had a long cold walk back that day. Pulpwood salvage was mostly done with a long string of booms chained together. The larger boat would tow the outside end of the booms, and the gas-powered punt would tow the shore end of the booms with a man up to his waist in the water guiding it. This was termed pulling the punt. The rest of the crew went ahead and, using pickeroons, would stick the pulpwood and work it into the water to be gathered up into the booms. At the end of the day, the boom ends would be brought together, creating a raft. We also used any means necessary to get the wood off the shore and into our raft. After retiring from fishing, Uncle Jack bought the Morning Star, which he used mainly for pleasure, but did some chartering as well as taking care of the navigation boys. His son Gerard now has the boat and continues with the contract to maintain the boys. The Seagull 3 is now on Lake Nipigon, is privately owned, and was renamed Natalia Rose. In the park near the mudflats, a memorial was created in commemoration to the Dampier family and Dampier's Landing. I hope this video was an entertaining and informative glimpse of what it was like to be a Dampier on Lake Superior. Many thanks to the main contributors, Aunt Rosalie, Uncle Kenny and Aunt Enie, Cousin Sonny, and Boone. Thanks for watching, folks.